Loch Ness. For centuries, there have been legends of monsters living in the deep, cold body of water located in the heart of the Scottish Highlands, with stories of a monster in the loch's waters reaching back at least 1500 years and perhaps much further. The loch, with its peat-stained water and vast depths, being seen by locals as the perfect abode for a monster. For thousands of years, people have lived on the shores of Loch Ness, likely since the end of the last glaciation around 10,000 years ago, with tales of a monster in the loch having been persistent in local Highland folklore throughout. But it was not until the 1930s that the legend of one particular monster in Loch Ness began to develop and eventually exploded into a worldwide phenomenon, with the increase in monster sightings coinciding with the construction of a road on the northern shore of Loch Ness, which opened up the area to tourists and resulted in sightings that, once reported in local newspapers, would bring the legend of the Loch Ness Monster into public consciousness throughout the world, with the debate on whether the Loch Ness Monster truly exists or is a long-upheld mythological tradition still being fiercely debated to this very day. Welcome to Unknown History. In this documentary, we will be examining the fascinating history surrounding the legend of the Loch Ness Monster. First describing the loch itself and its geographical history and how the first humans arrived here. Then examining the vast cultural history of the mysterious creature in the loch and cataloging the famous sightings and searches for the creature up until our modern day, concluding with an examination of science's explanations for the creature and its impacts on modern culture. So what exactly is the Loch Ness Monster? This is a fierce debate that surrounds the creature till this very day, with even the most critical of skeptics not doubting that most sightings of the supposed creature are genuine. Most reports of the monster sightings have been similar, describing a large animal with a long neck and small head, between 20 and 30 feet long, and sometimes with flippers on the side of its body when that portion of the animal is visible. This description closely matches a prehistoric plesiosaur, which consequently is how the animal is portrayed in most modern depictions. Many disbelievers in the monster myth speculate about what this alleged creature could be. There are explanations ranging from giant eels to escaped circus elephants. Some believe that when the River Ness is high enough, animals may even come in from the North Sea, such as seals, otters, or even small whales. However, to fully understand the Loch Ness Monster and speculate on its true nature, we must first understand the fascinating history of Loch Ness itself and the cultural heritage of the Scottish Highlands. There is a legend of the creation of Loch Ness, which was passed down through Highland tradition and recorded in the 1914 book by William Mackay called Urquhart and Glenmorston. In this myth, there is a bountiful and fertile valley sheltered on all sides by high mountains. The valley was fed by a pure spring with a powerful property to heal any disease, a blessing bestowed to those who dwelt in the valley by Daly the Druid. Daly laid a protective stone over the spring, and he commanded that it should be replaced immediately following the drawing of any water. He said, "The day on which my command is disregarded, desolation will overtake this land." For many years, the people followed the Druid's advice and were diligent to replace the stone each time they drew water from the spring. However, one day a woman went to the spring and left her child at home to play near the fireside. Just as she had finished filling her pail with water, she heard her child cry out and knew he was in danger of being burnt. She rushed back to her home and saved the child. Yet in her panic, she had neglected to cover the spring once more. To the dismay of the people living in the valley, the spring overflowed and began to rapidly fill the long, narrow valley. The people retreated into the highlands and lamented in Gaelic, "The Loch Ness an, the Loch Ness an," meaning there is a lake now, there is a lake now. And the hills and mountains echoed back in their sorrowful cry. The loch had remained in this same valley to this very day, and is now known as Loch Ness. This story demonstrating that Loch Ness has been a subject of fascination for the people living near it for many generations. And while the origins of the loch in human history have become a subject matter of legend, the actual origins of Loch Ness predate human habitation of the area. Loch Ness is located in the northernmost section of the Great Glen of Scotland, a large landmass situated between the Atlantic Ocean and North Sea. The loch lies near the Great Glen Fault, one of the Great Three fault lines in Scotland. The Great Glen Fault is the most active of the three and is the main source of most tremors and earthquakes in Britain. It is possible that early human settlers might have attributed such tremors to the rumblings of a hidden monster rather than the fault line. During the last glaciation, over 10,000 years ago, Scotland was covered by 4,000 feet of ice. Nothing but the tallest mountain, Ben Nevis, which is 60 miles to the southwest of Loch Ness, was left exposed. Glaciation smoothed out the sides of the Great Glen and created landforms such as the long, thin double basin of Loch Ness, the largest lake in all of Britain. At the end of the last ice age, as the glaciers subsided, the landmass of Scotland, no longer weighed down by thick sheets of ice, rose slowly by a few millimeters each year. Fjords once connected to the ocean were eventually cut off and became inland lakes. Over time, these isolated lakes lost their salinity due to rainwater, tributary rivers, and burns in streams flowing into them. Certain marine species, such as salmon and trout, were trapped in these lakes and evolved to survive in the new freshwater environment. This evidence of other adapted animals has inspired theories regarding the ancestral origins of the Loch Ness Monster. Not long after the end of the last glaciation, the first humans started to appear in the area. Very little is known about the first inhabitants of the Scottish Highlands. It is inferenced that they migrated in log canoes and hide-covered boats up the coast of Britain. Evidence has been found in some forms of high concentrations of shellfish remains along coastal areas where these first peoples likely traveled. There is also more recent evidence dated to around 5000 BC of hunter-gatherers living in the area. A hearth along with flint shells and red deer bones were excavated from a site in Inverness, a city just north of Loch Ness. Another site with shellfish debris and red deer antlers was found in Murraytown, just across the River Ness, which dates to approximately 4000 BC. There is some evidence, such as hazelnut trees growing in greater concentration than usual, that early hunter-gatherers managed some of the woodlands around Loch Ness as a food source. After 3500 BC, when agriculture was developed in Britain, early farmers cleared some of the woodland near the loch. Little evidence remains of these farmers, except for a few objects made of stone. 3 stone axes were found in 1892 near Loch Ness that date to the beginning of agriculture in Britain, and they were most likely used to clear the woodlands surrounding their agricultural fields. Once agriculture commenced in the Highlands, the farmers began building settlements, but still very little was built on the shores of Loch Ness itself. The exceptions to this were the structures built for their strategic view of the loch, such as Fort Augustus on the south end and Urquhart Castle close to the north end of the loch. And although Loch Ness is believed to be home to the most famous of Highland monsters, this creature is by no means the only one in Scottish lore. Since the loch was first inhabited, it seems there was a traditional belief of monsters and spirits dwelling within it, including denizens such as water horses, kelpies, water bulls, and sea serpents. A kelpie is traditionally known as a sly horse-like creature that lures weary travelers from their paths into bogs or lakes where they are subsequently drowned. Oral traditions within the Highlands from various cultures that settled there speak of giant sea serpents. Celts, Vikings, and Picts all have tales of malevolent sea monsters that would prey upon unwary seafarers. Located only a mile or two from Loch Ness on the grounds of the Balmacan House are Neolithic carvings of giant sea serpents drawn by the first settlers of the loch. Ancient ritual and symbol stones carved by Pictish inhabitants of the Highlands also depicted serpents and other monsters. It seems there was a widespread belief in the Highlands of mysterious loch inhabitants, not solely limited to Loch Ness, for multiple bodies of water even bear the name Loch na Beaste, meaning Lake of the Beast. The earliest records available referencing monsters in Loch Ness were written by Celtic missionaries who traveled through the Scottish Highlands, spreading Christianity in the 5th century. The most prominent of these missionaries was Saint Columba, who is said to have encountered a water monster in the River Ness. This tale is recorded by Abbot Adman of Iona in his famous work Vita Columbae, or the Life of Saint Columba, which he wrote sometime in the 7th century. The tale recalls that 1400 years ago, in the year 565, Columba saw in Loch Ness the Aquilis Bestia, as Adaman had named it. In one version of the story, Columba came across a group of Picts burying a man bitten by the monster. It was then said that Columba placed his holy staff upon the man's chest and brought him back to life. A different version tells of a Pict who was killed by the monster while swimming. Seeing this, Columba ordered one of his men to swim after him. The man did so without hesitation, and when the monster reappeared, St. Columba made the sign of the cross and said, "Thou shalt go no further, nor touch the man. Go back with all speed." In terror, the monster retreated immediately, and the man's life was spared. A third version of the story recalls St. Columba and the monster of Loch Ness coming to a peaceful agreement. The Aquilis Bestia willingly towed the saint's boat from one shore to the other, and in thanks, Columba granted it with freedom within Loch Ness for all eternity. Despite these fascinating tales, many locals living near Loch Ness are adamant that there has never been a tradition of monsters or mythical creatures living in Loch Ness. Still, it would be almost 1,300 years after Columba's sightings that stories of sightings of the Loch Ness Monster would be documented again. Reasons for the lack of documentation of such a large creature may be related to the inaccessibility of the area to large numbers of tourists until the 19th century. As fear of the supposedly savage Highlanders decreased, tourists from southern Great Britain traveled through the Highlands to see the lochs and castles, which naturally would bring about the potential for more sightings than ever before. The drought of sightings would be broken on July 1st, 1852, when the Inverness Courier reported a scene from Loch End, where two strange animals were swimming across the loch. Some thought it as a sea serpent coiling along the surface, and others a couple of whales or large seals. The inhabitants, whipped into a frenzy of fear by the creatures, made ready to defend themselves with everything from battle axes to pitchforks. At last, a local leader in the area came to the conclusion that the two mystery creatures were likely a pair of deer. The man fetched his gun and was about to fire upon the creatures when he threw down his gun and shouted in Gaelic, "God protect us! They are the water horses!" The man, now seeing the creatures, believed they were the ill-omened kelpies of Scottish folklore. In the end, the creatures did turn out to be horses, two ponies from the Aberdeen estate, no less than a mile away, that had escaped and swam into the loch to cool off during a hot July day. Nearly a decade later, in the autumn of 1868, the Inverness Courier reported a curious incident of a huge fish washed dead upon the beach of the loch, at about 2 meters long. Some think the strange fish may have been reported years back and was finally pronounced to be a skinned dolphin, possibly thrown overboard by a waggish crew of passing fishing boats to fool the credulous natives of the loch. This is the earliest written reference so far discovered to a tradition of something strange in Loch Ness. A few years later, in October 1871, D. Mackenzie of Balnain reportedly saw an object resembling a log or an upturned boat wriggling and churning up the water, moving slowly at first before disappearing at a faster speed. The account was not published until 1934, when Mackenzie sent his story in a letter to Rupert Gould shortly after popular interest in the monster had increased, and the stigma attached with reporting a sighting had diminished. Nearly a decade later, in 1980, the diver Duncan MacDonald was commissioned to examine a ship that had sunk off the southern end of the loch near Fort Augustus. Not long after he had been lowered into the water, he began sending desperate signals that he wanted to be pulled back up. When he emerged, he was pale with fear and shaking and refused to speak of his experience for days. Finally, when he did speak, he said that as he had examined the sunken ship's keel, he had seen an enormous animal lying on a shelf of rock next to the ship. He said it was a very odd-looking beastie, like a huge frog. From then on, he never dove in Loch Ness ever again. Several years later, in 1888, Mason Alexander MacDonald sighted a large stubby-legged animal surfacing from the loch and propelling itself within 50 yards of the shore where he stood. MacDonald reported his sighting to the Loch Ness water bailiff Alexander Campbell and described the creature as looking like a giant monstrous salamander. The next major sighting would occur nearly 2 decades later when Mr. James Cameron, the head keeper of the Balmacan estate, claimed that while he was fishing from a small boat, an enormous animal had surfaced near him. The shock caused him to go dizzy, and he rowed ashore as quickly as he could. Despite some of these sightings making local news in the late 1800s and early 1900s, the story of the Loch Ness Monster was relatively unknown outside of Scotland until the 20th century. However, this would all change when official sightings were published in newspapers in 1933. Interest in the loch itself and what might live within it was not inspired until improvements were made in 1933 to the A82 highway, a 23-mile road stretching along the north shore of the loch. A screen of trees was cleared, offering a better view of the water, which might explain the increase in monster sightings that year. The most famous sighting of that year being reported by Mrs. Adley McKay, manageress of a local hotel, who was on the road back from Inverness when she saw something resembling a whale in the loch. Being absolutely puzzled by what she had seen, she did not publicize the story, but did report it to Alex Campbell, the local water bailiff and enthusiast of the legend. Campbell then gave the story to the Inverness Courier, who published it on the 2nd of May 1933. This is often seen as the birthplace of the modern-day Loch Ness Monster legend, and over 90 years later, there have been thousands of recorded sightings since. Shortly after the Inverness Courier story broke, the Scottish Daily Express also published a reported sighting of a mystery fish in the loch. About a month later, on July 22nd, a Mr. Spicer and his wife were driving along the south shore of Loch Ness when at about 3:30 p.m. he saw crossing the road the nearest approach to a dragon or prehistoric animal that I have ever seen in my life. The Spicers only saw the creature for a few seconds at a distance of about 200 yards, with the lower part of its body being hidden by a rise in the road. Nevertheless, it seemed to have a long neck and preponderous body. They described the creature as having a large body, about 4 feet or 1.2 meters high, and about 25 feet or 8 meters long, and a long, wavy, narrow neck, slightly thicker than an elephant's trunk and just as long. The Spicers stated that the creature lurched across the road towards the loch about 20 yards away, leaving a trail of broken undergrowth in its wake, and that it had an animal in its mouth and had a body that was fairly big with a high back, but if there were any feet of any kind, they must have been webbed, and as for the tail, we cannot say, as it moved so rapidly, and when we got to the spot where it had disappeared into the loch, there was nothing left. On August 4th, 1933, the Inverness Courier published a report of the Spicers' fascinating encounter. This subsequently triggered a massive amount of public interest and an uptick in alleged sightings. This report also led to the creature being officially dubbed the Loch Ness Monster. It must also be mentioned that this is the first report that describes the creature's long neck, which has become a staple in almost all modern-day Loch Ness Monster sightings. It was also the beginning of the international sensation that would become the Loch Ness Monster. Monsters at the time were in vogue, and only a few months before, the film King Kong had been released, containing frightening footage of prehistoric animals fighting. The Spicers had also seen the film and considered what they saw at the loch that day to resemble the screen animation depiction of a Diplodocus. A few months later, on September 22nd of that same year, a Mrs. J.S. Fraser and 4 others are at the halfway house tea room along the loch, where they sighted a quite large creature with a very large neck. Their sighting is the first to reference a long-necked creature actually swimming in the loch. 3 hours later, there is a similar report about 10 miles north. About 3 weeks later, a local paper, The Scotsman, reports that in early September, Alex Campbell, the local water bailiff, had a sighting of a long-necked plesiosaur-like creature near Fort Augustus, which dived upon the approach of 2 local fishing boats. It was also around this time that a Rupert Gold would begin interviews with over 50 eyewitnesses of the alleged creature the following year, and publishes 42 sightings in his book, and concludes that some kind of creature has made its way into the loch and has become trapped, with him proposing that a large undiscovered amphibian is responsible. Around this time, the notorious Loch Ness Monster was causing quite a stir throughout the United Kingdom, and this prompted the Daily Mail to mount an expedition in search of the creature. In December 1933, the Commission selected Marmaduke Wetherell, a big game hunter, to locate the sea serpent. Along the lake shores, he found large footprints that he believed belonged to a very powerful soft-footed animal, about 20 feet or 6 meters in length. However, upon closer inspection, zoologists at the Natural History Museum determined that the tracks were identical and made with an umbrella stand or ashtray that had a hippopotamus leg as a base. The role Wetherell played in this hoax was unclear. Despite this embarrassment, Wetherell himself also claims a sighting of a gray seal and sketches what he and others saw as a large penguin. Subsequent monster hunters tended to disregard the possibility of seals, partly on the strength of opinion of the water bailiff Alex Campbell, as he had stated they had never been known to enter the loch. Nevertheless, some descriptions of the monster are very seal-like. For example, a sighting by Mr. Palmer on August 11th of 1933 describes a head just breaking the water, just like a typical seal would do when low on air. About a month after the Daily Mail's failed expedition, on January 5th, 1934, a motorcyclist, Arthur Grant, claimed to have nearly hit the creature at about 1 a.m. on a moonlit night. According to Grant, it had a small head attached to a long neck, and that the creature saw him and sprinted across the road into the loch. Grant, a veterinary student, described it as a cross between a seal and a plesiosaur. He said he dismounted and followed it to the loch, but only saw ripples in the water. Grant produced a subsequent sketch of the creature that was then examined by zoologist Maurice Burton, who stated it was consistent with the appearance and behavior of a giant otter. Regarding the long size of the creature reported by Grant, he suggested this was due to a faulty observation due to the poor lighting conditions. Paleontologist Darren Naish had suggested that Grant may have either seen an otter or seal and exaggerated his sighting and the creature's features over time. Later in the spring of 1934, another infamous event in the story of the Loch Ness Monster would occur when the surgeon Kenneth Wilson claims to have taken an interesting photograph on the loch. The photograph, published on April 21st, shows an upraised head and neck coming out of the water. It would become the most famous image of the Loch Ness Monster to date. It also would have the effect of restricting the scope of the debate regarding the identity of the monster from seals and strange fish that do not have such long necks. The surgeon's photograph created a large buzz around the monster and prompted Sir Edward Mountain to employ 20 Inverness men as watchers for the monster, paying them £2 a week to watch the loch for any strange activity. During this time, 11 sightings are made and 5 photographs taken, most attributable to boat wakes. However, on September 15th, the expedition's leader, Captain James Fraser, takes a film from near Urquhart Castle. Sadly, the film has been lost to time, but when shown to scientists at the time, they believed that it showed a living animal, a seal. This conclusion would be disputed by the local water bailiff Alex Campbell. This debate would finally be settled in 1985 when it became definitely established that seals do enter the loch, and since then both common and gray seals have been recorded in most years. They follow salmon up the River Ness and may spend months in the freshwater of Loch Ness. However, the seal theory was to prove too mundane for most monster enthusiasts, who were quick to note that sightings were still persisting, and there always was the surgeon's photograph with its long and upraised head and neck to point to. And while the sightings of the years of 1933 and 1934 would firmly establish the myth and legend of the Loch Ness Monster, in the following years few notable sightings and events would occur. The only event of note being a Captain D. Munro attempting to raise £1,500 to set up 3 24-hour camera stations on Loch Ness. However, the project only attracted £90 of investment, and the scheme was shortly abandoned thereafter. The rather sudden lack of sightings and interest in the creature, likely due to the British public and press's firm focus on its struggles with the Axis powers in World War II. It would be until the post-war years of the 1950s that the Loch Ness Monster would again grab headlines, the silence finally being broken on July 14, 1951, when Lachlan Stewart takes a photo of 3 angular humps close to the beach. Shortly after the sighting was reported, Lachlan Stewart confessed to a local resident, the author Richard Frey, that the photograph was indeed a hoax. Frey, however, did not reveal this secret for over 30 years. Despite being a hoax, the photo once again spiked public interest in the creature, culminating in the 1957 Constant White book, More Than a Legend, being published. As the wife of a Caledonian canal manager, Whitehead came to Loch Ness in the late 1930s, and through her research found that sightings had persisted even after the sensational sightings of the 30s, and had even written an article detailing these sightings in 1949. Her book, More Than a Legend, would ultimately detail more than 60 sightings and concluded that the loch contained a resident population of unknown creatures. White's book also drew on experiences of sincere people and tried to show that the Loch Ness Monster was no mere 30s frivolity, but a puzzle that was worth an investigation. Indeed, it was a mystery that she felt the nation had an obligation to investigate. The series of classic photos, plus the apparent frequency of sightings by Sir Edmund Mountain's expedition, suggested that organized surveillance might succeed in discovering this unknown creature. The book ultimately inspired two zoologists at the Natural History Museum of Britain to take an interest. Dr. Dennis Tucker lectured to students at Cambridge University who began to plan an expedition, while Dr. Maurice Burton was busy providing data to an enthusiastic aeronautical engineer named Tim Dinsdale. Dinsdale, on the sixth and last day of his search, would take a 4-minute film which would ultimately become one of the best-known pieces of evidence for the Loch Ness Monster's existence. For most of the film, the object has the dimensions and appearance and the speed of a powered rowing boat. However, many believe that it shows an unidentified animal because of the subtle differences in the propeller wash. The zoologist Maurice Burton had studied the problem for many years and encouraged Dinsdale's early interest, but he was to become skeptical of the film and much else. Despite the skepticism from some, an assessment of the film was performed in 1966 by Britain's Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Center that concluded that the photographer would have noticed a boat had it been one. Dinsdale would then publish a book about his encounter the following year and devoted his life to vindicating himself and other eyewitnesses. He made many visits to the loch and published widely on the subject of the monster until his death in 1987. In the summer of the same year, Colonel Blondie Halser mounted an 8-week expedition from his junk-rigged yacht, the Jester, which worked in concert with a shore station equipped with long-lens cameras. 56 volunteers took part, and the watches on the Jester were continuous by day and night. Ultimately, there was over 1,000 hours of observation and hydrophone work performed. However, the results of the expedition were inconclusive. These expeditions, however, would gather even further attention late that summer and would result in the first full-scale scientific investigation in search of the Loch Ness Monster. Peter Baker would lead this combined Oxford and Cambridge University expedition to the loch. No longer was the Loch Ness Monster being tracked by locals and amateur monster hunters. Now professional scholars with vast resources were on its trail. Baker's team stationed film cameras around the loch, keeping 85% of its surface under observation for 230 hours straight and 50% of the surface for a further 250 hours. They make 19 sightings, from which they concluded that the multi-humped sea serpent sightings were caused by boat wakes. They also found that diving birds caused some long-neck sightings. Nevertheless, there were also some strange echoey sounding contacts made on the hydrophones that the team could not explain. The inconclusive yet intriguing finds from the Oxford and Cambridge University expeditions leads to the founding of the Loch Ness Phenomenon Investigation Bureau, LNI for short, which forms under the energetic leadership of David James, with other notable members being author Constance White and naturalist Sir Peter Scott and Richard Fitter. David James, with his background of naval service and Antarctic exploration, brings an acute mind and outstanding organizational ability to the search. He would also show a bold ingenuity in his early expeditions, with rock blasting to simulate the canal construction occurring in the loch in the 1930s. He would also use wartime searchlights to probe the loch for nocturnal activity. James's efforts would turn a national joke into a national endeavor. Using his position ruthlessly, he had panels of eminent zoologists and barristers examine his evidence, together with the Ministry of Defense photo interpreters. He also would subject his observers to psychological examination to ensure that they were sane and competent. After its initial founding, for the next 10 years, the LNI would mount extensive surface surveillance using telephoto cinematic cameras, this way aiming to repeat the classic photographs on good quality film. The investigation reveals a definite correlation between calm, Nessie weather and sightings. They also shoot film on 12 occasions, but none shows anything resembling the classic photographs from the 30s. They overall collect 258 total sighting reports. Despite the LNI's best efforts, it was clear that something was wrong. The war of attrition against the law of averages had seemed lost. In human terms, the evidence for unusual creatures in the loch was overwhelming, yet photographic surveillance on the most massive and protracted scale could not produce any verification of said sightings. Despite this, some progress was still made. Categories of sightings were now recognized. Peter Baker's lessons about multi-hump sightings had also been slowly relearned by the members of the LNI. Through the ranks of the organization, there was also a growing objectivity born of their experience of the loch's power to deceive. People like Dick Rayner, who had taken the LNI's best film, and Rip Heppel, who had circulated a newsletter for 30 years after its demise, were now experts at sighting diagnosis. Also around this time, the American Roy Mackal had become scientific director of the LNI and began to turn the organization towards underwater techniques including hydrophones, sonar, and despite the peat-stained water of the loch, a brand new and revolutionary technology, underwater photography. In one way, this was an evasion of the basic question of eyewitness verification, but the team also saw it as a more direct and perhaps more conclusive way to solve the mystery of Loch Ness. At this time, general scientific work would also start in small Irish and Scottish lochs with similar monster traditions, likely in an attempt to avoid the problems of scale that the massive Loch Ness posed. These investigations would generate a spectacular report from Loch Morar, which was known to have a monster tradition itself and resulted in the formation of a totally new group, the Loch Morar Survey. Loch Morar was only half the length of Loch Ness, which meant less ground to cover, though logistics would be found more difficult through the lack of roads to the site. The key difference, however, was the relative clarity of Loch Morar's water when compared to Loch Ness's peat-stained water. And while the initial sighting would be confirmed to be a misidentification, Morar was to become a major focus of efforts to find the Loch Ness Monster during the decade of underwater photography in the 1970s. However, despite the LNI's efforts, after 10 years there was still no conclusive evidence of the monster's existence, with this ultimately leading to the LNI disbanding in 1972. And with that, the camera batteries at Loch Ness and Loch Morar were also dismantled, and the constant passive monitoring of the loch's surface was over for the time being. Individual surveillance efforts would continue on a smaller scale, but it would not be until the 21st century and the invention of live stream cameras that this level of monitoring on the surface of Loch Ness would be matched again. Despite the LNI's ultimate disbandment in 1972, some new faces at Loch Ness would soon contribute to the most compelling evidence for the case of the monster since the infamous surgeon's photograph from the 1930s. At 1:45 a.m., an underwater camera deployed by the Academy of Applied Science under the leadership of Robert Rines and Peter Scott takes what becomes known as the flipper photograph and the gargoyle head photographs amid swirling silt in the loch. After alleged computer enhancement, the photographs are published and do indeed look like a flipper and a misshapen head of an unidentified animal. The Academy of Applied Science, after presenting this groundbreaking evidence, had its findings published in Nature on December 11, 1975. This issue included 2 of the 1972 photographs, together with a sonar chart supposedly covering the event. The issue also included a whole body shot that the group had captured in that same year of 1975. With this evidence, the animal's official species was placed under protection by the British government in 1975 under the name Nessiterax rhomboraxirainen, meaning wonder of Ness with a diamond-shaped fin. This was a major victory for the believers in the Loch Ness Monster, being an unidentified new species of animal. The animal in the photograph was facing almost head-on to the camera. Beneath the body were 2 clearly definable appendages. The skin looked very rough and potted, even at this range, which was estimated to be about 30 to 40 feet, and was a red-brown color. It was the head of the creature in close-up detail from a range of about 8 feet, which displayed the open mouth of the animal and what appeared to be teeth inside of it. A prominent bony ridge ran down the center of the face into a thick, hard-looking upper lip, one on either side of the central ridge. Most remarkably of all, there were 2 clearly defined stalks or tubes protruding from the top of the creature's head. These protrusions subsequently caused the photo to be pinned the gargoyle head photograph. Despite being the most major evidence of the Loch Ness Monster's existence in nearly half a century, reproductions of these pictures are of very low quality, which left them open to skepticism, with the photos providing proof to those who already believed and further reason to doubt for those who did not. Despite the claims that had been made by the Academy of Applied Science, the scientific community still held that the Loch Ness Monster likely could be explained by other natural phenomena and disagreed that sightings were caused by a creature unknown to science. However, this new evidence did again result in renewed interest in the creature and in gathering undeniable evidence of its existence. This resulted in the National Geographic Society placing cameras and sonar devices underwater in the loch in a massive effort to find the creature. The vigils, however, like in the past, after being manned for months, are unrewarded, and the team for National Geographic left the loch without any real evidence. The failure of such a well-funded and well-known organization like National Geographic seemed to indicate that the methods of gathering the proof of the creature's existence via photography underwater were unlikely due to the poor visibility of the loch's dark, peat-stained water. The thoughts of researchers now turned towards the enigmatic sonar contacts that had been made from time to time. By 1979, the Loch Morar expedition had, with the encouragement of David James, become the Loch Ness and Loch Morar Project. This project would work at both Loch Ness and Loch Morar and would turn towards an active study of the environment in order to try to catch an image of the creature on sonar. The disbanded LNI would now wind up transferring its materials and finances to the new project, with former LNI directors Norman Collins, David James, and Sir Peter Scott becoming patrons of the project. From now on, the investigators themselves would have to become proficient naturalists, photo and sonar interpreters, and above all else, experts on the loch and its topography. The Loch Ness Project's first large effort would begin in the summer of 1981 with the creation of a special sonar patrol vessel, a 40-foot catamaran built on inflatables called the John Murray. This vessel was built on the beach and was run 24 hours a day in silent patrols along the length of the loch. This is the beginning of a truly systematic assessment of unusual sonar contacts. The first significant sonar contact encountered by the team, which was then subsequently confirmed with underwater television, establishes that there are Arctic cod living at the loch bed at around 220 meters of depth. Over the next 2 years, the Loch Ness Project records 1,500 hours of patrols using scanning sonar. It becomes clear, though, that illusions can still occur underwater with sonar, just as well as they had done on the surface and with underwater photography. Rules are established to assess contacts, with 40 contacts of exceptional strength and depth being recorded, with some observers claiming they saw the contacts move. Due to the large number of significant sonar contacts that have been observed in the few years, in 1985 the Loch Ness Project establishes a fixed sonar station in the center of the southern basin at 170 meters of depth. The station, dubbed the Monitor, is a raft on a 4-point mooring involving nearly 2 kilometers or a mile of rope. This station allowed the scanning sonar of the project to be much more accurate and even plot a target's movements. However, after this more precise system is introduced, the strongest contacts cease. This would cause skeptics to state that the lack of contacts was due to the more precise system and that the sightings of the previous years were due to the faults of the previous system, while the believers claimed that the lack of contacts was simply due to the curse of the loch and bad luck. Despite the mixed results from the Loch Ness Project sonar scans, public interest in the creature was still high. This resulted in one of the stranger attempts to prove the Loch Ness Monster's existence when in 1985, Stephen Whittle, supported by Vladimir Vodka, attempted to trap the creature in a 60 by 20 foot cage submerged in the loch, with Whittle intending to release the creature after he photographed it. Unsurprisingly, Whittle was unsuccessful in this effort. However, the scheme did cause quite a stir and got plenty of media coverage at the time, which, with this being a commercially sponsored expedition, was likely the true goal all along. Around this same time, the Loch Ness Project had been further refining their search methods via sonar. In the summer of 1985, they would make a major discovery that the largest sonar contacts in the loch were caused by huge underwater waves, which drew attention to objects floating on the surface. These waves were described by Dr. Stephen Thorpe in 1972 and take place along the thermocline, which is the boundary between the dense, cold, deep water and the lighter, warmer water floating on top. In the summer, the warmer water can be blown to the northern end of the loch by the prevailing southwest wind, tilting the thermocline in that direction. As the wind drops, the warm water flows back and forth for some weeks. When this happens, objects on the surface such as logs can be borne against the wind, looking like swimming animals. Underwater, huge waves form on the thermocline. One measured in the summer of 1985 was near 40 meters high, and while nearly invisible at the surface, they cause gigantic sonar traces under the water. These waves probably being what caused the strange contacts made by the Birmingham University team in 1968. And while the discovery of the effects of the thermocline on the loch were important, this did not mean the end of sonar contacts and tracing in the loch. Far from it. Several years later, in 1988, a team led by Adrian Shine, dubbed Operation Deep Scan, would draw a sonar curtain along the loch. This was achieved by using 20 vessels that were equipped with Lowrance echo sounders, which then formed a slow-moving line to scan the entire length of the loch. When interesting contacts were made, a follow-up flotilla was moved to plot the positions. By revisiting these positions, it was possible to see whether the objects had moved or whether they were buoyant debris tethered in some way to the bed of the loch. Most of the contacts that were made during this expedition were fixed and ended up being debris, but 3 had disappeared, and while not being big enough to be the 10-meter monster of legend, they were apparently stronger than fish echoes and were lying much deeper in the water column. These contacts are still unexplained to this very day, with believers in the monster myth pointing to them as possible evidence of an unknown creature in the loch. Though skeptics also assert the possibility that the contacts were caused by some form of unrecognized interference between the sounders. It is also possible that some of the strong deepwater contacts could have been seals, which are known to visit the loch every year and dive to quite deep depths. Despite Operation Deep Scan not revealing the monster, it had swept the loch clear for science, having provided researchers with a more accurate map of the loch below the surface than ever before. The many fish identified during the operation also led to researchers approaching the investigation in search of the monster in a brand new way. Instead of trying to track the creature itself, they would focus on the loch's food chain, in an attempt to prove if it was even possible that a creature the size of the alleged Loch Ness Monster could even survive based on the loch's available food items. A year later, in 1989, a follow-up operation dubbed Operation Echo would be undertaken, with many exercises towards this end being undertaken, including the first quantitative acoustic estimates of the fish population of Loch Ness. 3 years later, the Loch Ness Project would complete its sampling, with a 3-year study being published on Loch Ness's food chain by Lancaster University. The project also publishes a series of papers in the Scottish Naturalist Journal. One of the study's most interesting findings was that there was only about 20 tons of fish available as food in the loch. This led biologists to conclude that there should only be around 2 tons of monster population in the loch. This discovery became quite a problem for the popular theory of the Loch Ness Monster being a plesiosaur, as the largest species of plesiosaurs could weigh upwards of 10 tons or more, with the smallest known species weighing still about half a ton. Around the same time, Nicholas Witchell's expedition, Project Urquhart, involving the Natural History Museum and the Freshwater Biological Association, was performing a similar study, with their findings indicating even less fish, only about 1.2 tons, with their final report indicating the quantity of open water fish in the loch is incapable of supporting a population of predators. However, they did find areas off the River Mouse where echo soundings suggested very high numbers of fish, and subsequently these were recognized as methane gas bubbles rising from decaying vegetation on the loch's floor. After the findings of these studies, another major revelation in the story of the Loch Ness Monster would occur in April of 1994, when the famous long-necked iconic photo, the surgeon's photograph, is exposed as a hoax. In collaboration between the Loch Ness Center and David Martin of the Loch Ness Project and the sighting expert Alistair Boyd, during a series of interviews with close associates of the surgeon. Instead of a fantastical creature poking its head out of the water, the sources instead alleged that the photograph was actually a clay model which had then been strapped to a remote submarine and driven into the loch and photographed. The surgeon, Kenneth Wilson, was a known stooge and prankster, which he had apparently confessed as much, at least twice, to the authors and monster hunters of the time, who still ignored him. Despite this testimony, to this day the true subject of the photograph is still debated by some, and the photograph remains the most well-known and culturally relevant photo surrounding the Loch Ness Monster. However, the photo being alleged as a hoax did permanent damage to its credibility in the eyes of skeptics and the public alike. After these major revelations of the food availability studies and the hoax allegations surrounding the surgeon's photograph, interest in the Loch Ness Monster would cool for several years, as around this time the scientific community had become quite skeptical in the creature's existence, with even some considering the case to be closed entirely. It would be nearly a decade later when the next major expedition to search for the creature was launched. In 2003, the BBC sponsored Searching for the Loch Ness Monster, aired on BBC One, featuring a search of the loch using 600 sonar beams and satellite tracking. The search had sufficient resolution to identify even a small buoy, however, no animal of substantial size was found, and despite the reported hopes, the scientists involved admitted they felt that this program proved the Loch Ness Monster was a myth. Several years later, the next major sighting would occur with the famous Holmes video of 2007. On May 26, 2007, a 55-year-old laboratory technician, Gordon Holmes, videotaped what he said was this jet-black thing, about 14 meters or 46 feet long, moving fairly fast in the water. Adrian Shine, a marine biologist at the Loch Ness 2000 Center, described the footage as among the best footage he had ever seen. BBC Scotland would broadcast the video on the 29th of May, and STV News North Tonight aired the footage on the 28th and interviewed Holmes about the sighting. Adrian Shine was also interviewed and suggested the footage may have been an otter, seal, or water bird. Despite the stir that was caused by this video evidence, it was still inconclusive in the minds of most skeptics. Several years later, on August 24, 2011, Loch Ness boat captain Marcus Atkinson photographed a sonar image of a 1.5 meter or 5 foot unidentified object that seemed to follow his boat at a depth of 23 meters or 75 feet and ruled out the possibility of a small fish or seal. Further analysis from a scientist at the National Oceanographic Center, however, would determine that this image was a bloom of algae or zooplankton. Believers in the monster, however, challenged this assessment and pointed to the fact that the sonar image had followed the boat for nearly 2 minutes. A year later, on August 3, 2012, skipper George Edwards claimed that a photo he took on the 2nd of November 2011 had shown the Loch Ness Monster. Edwards claims to have searched for the monster for 26 years and reportedly had spent 60 hours per week on the loch aboard his boat, the Nessie Hunter 4, taking tourists for rides on the loch. Edwards stated about the creature, "In my opinion, it probably looks like a kind of manatee, but not a mammal. When people see 3 humps, they are probably just seeing 3 separate monsters." Other researchers have questioned the photograph's authenticity, and Loch Ness Monster researcher Steve Feltham suggested that the object in the water is a fiberglass hump used in a National Geographic Channel documentary in which Edwards had participated. Researcher Dick Rayner had also questioned Edwards' claims of discovering a deeper bottom of the loch, which Rayner called the Edwards Deep. He also found inconsistencies between Edwards' claims for the location and conditions of the photograph and the actual location and weather conditions that day. Edwards would eventually admit in October of 2013 that his 2011 photograph was a hoax. However, he still insisted that his 1986 photograph provided to National Geographic was genuine. The next major modern-day sighting would occur on August 27, 2013, when tourist David Elder presented a 5-minute video of a mysterious wave in the loch. According to Elder, the wave was produced by a 15-foot or 4.5-meter solid black object just under the surface of the water. During the recording of the video, Elder was taking a video of a swan at the Fort Augustus Pier on the southwestern end of the loch when he captured the movement. He claimed that the water was very still at the time and there were no ripples coming off the wave and no other noticeable activity on the water. Skeptics, however, would suggest that the wave may have been caused by a wind gust or lone boat wake. In that same year, zoologist, angler, and television presenter Jeremy Wade investigated the creature as part of the well-known series River Monsters, with the program concluding that the creature could have been a Greenland shark. The Greenland shark, which can reach up to 20 feet in length, inhabits the North Atlantic Ocean around Canada, Greenland, Iceland, Norway, and possibly Scotland. It has a dark color and a small dorsal fin, which do line up with some sightings of the Loch Ness Monster. The next major sighting would occur on April 19, 2014, when it was reported that a satellite image on Apple Maps showed what appeared to be a large creature just below the surface of the loch. At the loch's far north end, the creature appeared to be about 30 meters or 98 feet long. Skeptics, however, offered possible explanations such as the wake of a large boat, seal-caused ripples, or floating driftwood. About a year later, and possibly inspired by the Apple Maps incident, Google commemorated the 81st anniversary of the surgeon's photograph with a Google Doodle, and added a new feature to Google Street View for which users could explore the loch above and below the water. Google reportedly had spent a week at Loch Ness collecting imagery with a Street View Trekker camera, attaching it to a boat to photograph above and below the surface of the water, collaborating with members of the Catalan Sea View Survey for underwater photography. However, despite the advanced search techniques used during the survey, no notable sightings were recorded. After the popular sightings via satellite images, an international team consisting of researchers from the universities of Otago, Copenhagen, Hull, and the Highlands did a DNA survey of the loch in June of 2018, looking for any unusual species. This was done by sampling water from the loch and looking for almost microscopic pieces of DNA. After a year of data collection and analysis, the results were published in 2019, with no DNA of large fish such as sharks, sturgeons, or catfish being found. No DNA from large mammals such as otters, seals, or whales was obtained either. The sole species that dominated this study was eels. The leader of the study, Professor Neil Gemmell of the University of Otago, said he could not rule out the possibility of eels of extreme size, though none were found nor ever caught during their study. The other possibility is that the large amount of eel DNA simply comes from many small eels. No evidence of any reptilian DNA sequences was found during the survey either. At the conclusion of the study, Professor Gemmell would add, "So I think we can be fairly sure that there is probably not any giant scaly reptile swimming around in Loch Ness." It would be several years later until the latest search for the creature would occur. On a weekend this August in 2023, one of the largest searches for the creature ever was conducted. Organizers billed the weekend's events as the largest organized Nessie hunt for 50 years, and hunters came armed with high-tech help, including sonar mapping of the lakebed, thermal imaging drones scanning the surface, and hydrophones to hear strange sounds from the depths of the loch. The events were also even open to the global public, with hundreds of people being invited to a live stream of the loch's surface to add more eyes to the search. However, despite volunteers' best efforts, the search failed to capture any direct evidence of the legendary monster. But it did reveal one thing: just how many people were invested in the Loch Ness Monster's existence even till this very day. According to some organizers, there were a few notable observations over that weekend, however, including 4 mysterious and previously unheard loud noises from the depths of the loch, and a giant shadow moving just beneath the surface, spotted on camera. However, despite the scale and effort of the search, no definitive evidence was captured, and to this very day the loch is still under constant surveillance with 24-hour live webcams that are set up around various locations on the loch, with many eyewitness accounts and pieces of photographic and video evidence still appearing frequently to this very day, yet none being the definitive proof of the Loch Ness Monster's existence. So now that we have cataloged the history of the Loch Ness Monster and all of its relevant sightings and expeditions for the creature up until our present day, what are some various explanations for the vast array of sightings going back centuries? A vast number of explanations have been suggested to account for sightings of the creature, and an even smaller number of whom eyewitness evidence outweighs all other considerations. In 1980, Swedish naturalist and author Bengt Sorgen wrote that present beliefs in lake monsters, such as the Loch Ness Monster, are associated with the Scottish tradition of Celtic Kelpie legends. According to Sorgen, accounts of the Loch Ness Monster have changed over time, originally describing horse-like creatures that were intended to keep children away from the loch's edges. Sorgen then asserts that the Kelpie legends ultimately developed into descriptions reflecting a modern-day plesiosaur. The Kelpie as a water horse in Loch Ness was mentioned first in 1879 in a Scottish newspaper and inspired Tim Dinsdale's project Water Horse. A study of pre-1933 Highland folklore references to kelpies, water horses, water bulls, and other types of water creatures, and indicated that Ness was the loch most frequently cited in these local legends. And while some true believers cite the Kelpie as the source of the Loch Ness Monster, the most popular belief among believers by far is that the creature is an undiscovered species of plesiosaur, or a possible descendant of a plesiosaur. The plesiosaur is a marine fish-eating reptile that lived in the British Isles about 70 million years ago. The theory suggests that a breeding population of plesiosaurs may have become landlocked in Loch Ness once the land rose after the last glaciation, and went on to inspire the sea serpent and kelpie myths that have been part of the local culture for thousands of years. The most common descriptions of the Loch Ness Monster closely match the way scientists believe plesiosaurs once looked: a long neck and small head, the larger body, and flippers on either side. However, it is unlikely that a group of plesiosaurs would have survived the mass extinction that occurred 65 million years ago, and even if they did, it is even less likely that their descendants also survived during the glacial cycles in Europe up until 10,000 years ago, as plesiosaurs would likely not have been well adapted for the cold waters of Loch Ness and needed an abundant source of food that Loch Ness could not provide. The journal The New Scientist also reported on the findings of Dr. Leslie Noe of Cambridge University's Sedgwick Museum, where he stated that plesiosaurs could not raise their necks into the air like the stereotypical photos and depictions of the Loch Ness Monster, with the findings stating that the osteology of a plesiosaur's neck make it almost certain that it could not lift its head out of the water like a swan. Roy Mackle, a professor at the University of Chicago in the 1970s, proposed another theory, that the Loch Ness Monster was the descendant of an ambolomer, a giant primitive amphibian thought to have lived around 270 million years ago. This theory matches Duncan MacDonald's description of a large frog-like creature from the 1880 sighting. The most critical skeptics of the Loch Ness Monster's existence also attribute the sightings to animals. However, these species are quite well known to science already and have been proven to exist and have not been extinct for millions of years. A large eel was an early and still popular suggestion for what exactly the Loch Ness Monster was. As the 2019 DNA survey proved, eels are found all throughout Loch Ness, and an unusually large specimen would explain many sightings. In a 1979 article, California biologist Dennis Power and geographer Donald Johnson claimed that the famous surgeon's photograph was actually the top of head, extended trunk, and flared nostrils of a swimming elephant, photographed elsewhere and then claimed to be from Loch Ness. In 2006, paleontologist and artist Neil Clark would suggest a similar thing about traveling circuses that visited the area for many years in the early 1900s, with the elephant's trunks being perceived as the head and neck, and the head and back of the elephant being perceived as the humps of the legendary Loch Ness Monster. As mentioned earlier, zoologist, angler, and television personality Jeremy Wade investigated the creature in 2013 as part of the series River Monsters, and concluded that the Loch Ness Monster may be a Greenland shark. According to biologist Bruce Wright, the Greenland shark could survive in fresh water and possibly use rivers and lakes to find sources of food, with Loch Ness having an abundance of salmon, eel, and other fish for the shark to possibly prey on. In July 2015, 3 news outlets reported that Steve Feltman, after holding a vigil at the loch that was recognized by the Guinness Book of World Records, theorized that the monster is an unusually large specimen of Wells catfish, which may have been released during the late 19th century. Due to it being difficult to judge the size of an object in water through a telescope or binoculars with no external references, another popular theory is that the Loch Ness Monster is simply resident otters and deer swimming in the loch, which was cited by author Ronald Bims, and may have been misinterpreted by many. According to Bims, birds may also have been mistaken for the head and neck sightings of the creature. And while the most popular theories often reference other species of animals, many natural phenomena and man-made effects have also been attributed to sightings of the monster and used in particular theories. So what aspects of the loch might inspire and perpetuate such a myth as the Loch Ness Monster? Edmund Burt describes the mountains surrounding Loch Ness as having stupendous bulk, frightful irregularity, and horrid gloom, and made them yet feel more sombrous by the shades and faint reflections they communicate to one another. The loch itself has many qualities which might inspire myths of monsters lurking beneath its dark waters. It can flood its shores easily, making it dangerous during times of high rainfall. The catchment area of Loch Ness is also quite large, meaning that the level of the loch can rise quite rapidly. For example, Loch Ness is recorded to have risen 9 feet between 1843 and 1847, and in 1849 alone it rose 4 feet in just one day, which led to severe flooding in many of the surrounding areas. Loch Ness, as a body of water, is also oligotrophic, which means that it is deficient in plant nutrients, yet still has a high oxygen content in the depths of the water. The waters have a low pH value, and the acidity combined with its steep banks do not allow for any significant plant growth. Some theories have suggested that sightings of the Loch Ness Monster have been attributed to floating islands or vegetation mats. However, this is unlikely due to the loch's unfriendly conditions for plant growth. The waters of Loch Ness are also quite acidic because of a large quantity of peat debris that is washed down from the bogs above the tree line by the tributary rivers and streams that flow into the loch. The peat particles are suspended in the water about 50 feet below the surface, making the water opaque and apparently quite eerie for divers. This peat accumulation has been increasing in Loch Ness since 1820, when the Caledonian Canal was constructed. The large amount of peat in the water of Loch Ness has led many skeptics to attribute the lack of visibility in the water caused by this to be one of the main contributing factors in the monster sightings by divers and in underwater photographs that appear to show images of the creature. The loch's geography also helps answer one of the more widely asked questions about the subject of the Loch Ness Monster, that being why, if there is a breeding population of large unknown animals, that no carcasses have ever been found of such creatures. This being explained in a local saying about Loch Ness: "The loch never gives up its dead." This is due to the loch's great depth and cold waters, with the loch claiming dead bodies and sinking them to unknown depths of the lake bottom. This feature of the loch likely being one that inspired fear and curiosity all the way back to the early inhabitants of the Great Glen, as all evidence of the past lies inaccessible on the loch's floor. Another recent theory suggests that the Loch Ness Monster used to exist, but has now been killed off by pollution in the loch. Currently, 9 sewage works empty into Loch Ness and have slowly been adding excess nutrients and causing eutrophication in the loch over the past few decades. The loch, however, is not only good at hiding things, but is also capable of producing monster-inspiring illusions, with some coming from natural phenomenon and others being man-made. For instance, boat wakes have been reported when the loch is calm, with no boats nearby. Bartender David Myrno reported a wake he believed was a creature zigzagging, diving, and reappearing, and that was reported by 26 other eyewitnesses in a nearby car park. Although some sightings described a V-shaped wake similar to a boat, others reported something not conforming to the shape of a boat. In the end, the true culprit was a 20-foot log being battered against the waves in the middle of the loch. Sightings like these have caused some to believe that trees are the primary source of Loch Ness Monster sightings, with this theory having some substantial credence. In 1933, the Daily Mirror published a picture with the caption, "This queerly shaped tree trunk washed ashore on the loch and is thought to be responsible for the reported appearance of a monster." Additionally, in a 1982 series of articles for New Scientist, Maurice Burton proposed that sightings of the Loch Ness Monster and similar creatures may simply be fermenting Scott pine logs rising to the surface of the loch. A decomposing log could not initially release gases caused by decay because of its high resin levels. This gas pressure would then eventually rupture a resin seal at one end of the log, propelling it through the water and sometimes to the surface, causing it to bob up and down. According to Burton, the shape of the tree logs with their branches and stumps could closely resemble the descriptions of the monster. Loch Ness, because of its long, straight shape, is subject to unusual ripples affecting its surface. A seich is a large oscillation of a lake caused by water reverting to its natural level after being blown to one end of the lake, resulting in a standing wave. The Loch Ness oscillation period takes about 32 minutes. Wind conditions that cause seiches also give a choppy, matte appearance to the water, with calm patches appearing dark from the shore as they reflect the mountains above. In 1979, W. H. Lynn showed that atmospheric refraction along with seiches could distort the shape and size of animals and objects in the water, and to prove his theory, he later published a photograph of a mirage of a rock on Lake Winnipeg that resembled a head and neck sticking out of the water, with some skeptics believing this theory explains the many sightings on Loch Ness. A callback must also be made for the explanation for some of the largest sonar contacts recorded at Loch Ness by researchers in the 1970s. These sonar contacts are caused by underwater waves which draw attention to objects floating on the surface. These waves were first described by Dr. Stephen Thorpe in 1972 and take place along the loch's thermocline, which is the boundary between the dense cold deep water and the lighter warmer water floating on top. Underwater, huge waves form on the thermocline, with these waves probably being what caused the strange sonar contacts made by the Birmingham University team in 1968. In the following years, the Loch Ness Project would also launch their largest expedition yet, with the largest sonar contacts in the loch likely also caused by these huge underwater waves, drawing attention to the effects of these upon objects floating on the surface of the loch. Some skeptics also believe that seismic activity caused by events such as earthquakes may also explain the large seiches and underwater waves observed in the loch. And while most earthquakes that occur in Scotland are far too weak to cause observable seiches on the surface of the loch, extremely massive earthquakes, even from far away, could cause large waves. For instance, the seich created in Loch Ness by the catastrophic 1755 Lisbon earthquake was reportedly so violent as to threaten destruction to some of the houses built on the side of the loch, while the aftershock in 1761 was apparently strong enough to cause 2-foot waves. However, no sightings of the monster were reported in 1755 or 1761. Yet this does still not stop some skeptics from pointing to this theory as a possible explanation for the creature. Another geological-related theory was put forth by Italian geologist Luigi Picardi, who proposed geological explanations for many ancient legends and myths. Picardi noted that the earliest recorded sighting of the Loch Ness Monster, appearing in the life of St. Columba, mentions the creature's emergence was accompanied with a loud roaring. Loch Ness sits along the Great Glen Fault, and Picardi asserts that this could be a description of an earthquake. He also points to many reports of the monster, which consist only of large disturbances on the surface of the water, which he asserts could be caused by earthquakes or releases of gas through the fault, which eyewitnesses then mistake for something swimming below the surface. And while there are many intriguing explanations and theories to explain the possible sightings of the Loch Ness Monster, it must also be mentioned that hoaxes play quite a prominent role in the history of sightings of the creature, with even the most iconic image of the Loch Ness Monster, that being the famous surgeon's photograph, being essentially confirmed as a hoax as well. A number of hoax attempts have been made over the years, some of which were successful. Other hoaxes were revealed rather quickly by the perpetrators or exposed after diligent research years later. A few examples are as follows. In August 1933, Italian journalist Francesco Gasparri submitted what he said was the first news article on the Loch Ness Monster. In 1959, he told reporters how in 1933 there were sightings of strange fish throughout the loch, and he had the inspiration to get a hold of the story about the strange fish. The idea of the monster had not initially dawned on him, but then he noted that the strange fish would likely not yield along an interesting article and decided to promote them to being an imaginary monster instead. Also in the 1930s, big game hunter Marmaduke Wetherell went to Loch Ness to look for the monster, where Wetherell claimed to have found footprints, but when casts of the footprints were sent to scientists for further analysis, they turned out to be from a hippopotamus, this likely coming from a prankster who had used a Victorian-era hippopotamus foot umbrella stand as a prop. In 1972, a team of zoologists from Yorkshire's Flamingo Park Zoo searched for the monster and discovered a large floating body in the water. The corpse was about 5 meters or 16 feet long and weighed about 1.5 tons. It was described by the Press Association as having a bare head and a brown scaly body with claw-like fins. The deceased creature was placed in a van to be carried away for testing, but police seized the cadaver under an Act of Parliament prohibiting the removal of unidentified creatures from Loch Ness. However, the true nature of the corpse was to be much more mundane. It was later revealed that Flamingo Park Education Officer John Shields had shaved the whiskers and otherwise disfigured a bull elephant seal's corpse that had died the week earlier and dumped it in Loch Ness in order to dupe his colleagues. Important information was also revealed by Operation Deep Scan in the late 1980s that would cast doubt on the famous gargoyle head in flipper photographs. It had since been discovered that the camera mooring itself to take those photographs was in much shallower water than claimed. In 1987, as part of Operation Deep Scan, a sunken tree stump was recovered from beneath the mooring position of the camera, which bears considerable resemblance to the figure in the gargoyle head photograph. In the second week of January 1988, Sir Peter Scott would receive even more unwelcome news regarding the photographs, when witnesses from the boat's crew operating the echo sounder producing the 1972 sonar trace that accompanied the flipper picture write to tell him that the sonar transducer was not fixed to the loch bed as the Academy diagram had indicated, but was swinging in mid-water, which would likely result in faulty readings. Marty Klein, the Academy sonar expert, had only made his comment that the trace showed a moving object on the basis that the transducer was actually fixed, and this new information made him doubt his analysis. Even worse, Alan Giuseppe, who was supposed to have done the computer enhancement of the photographs at Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, wrote to say that he was deeply concerned. As he stated, he had not worked on the photographs published in Nature, and that they were not computer enhanced, but actually appeared to be retouched. These revelations cast doubt and skepticism to what at the time was considered the best documented evidence for the creature's existence, with many skeptics outright dismissing the photographs as the result of a poorly executed investigation, and some even considering them to be outright hoaxes. Despite this, there are still many believers in the creature who point to these photographs as definitive evidence of the creature's existence, and the debate around their credibility continues to this very day. On July 2003, Gerald McSorley discovered a fossil supposedly from the creature when he tripped and fell into the loch. However, after examination, it was clear that the fossil had been planted. In 2004, a 5 TV documentary team using special effects experts tried to convince people that there was something in the loch. They constructed an animatronic model of a plesiosaur, calling it Lucy, and despite several setbacks, including Lucy falling to the bottom of the loch, ultimately about 600 sightings were reported where she was placed. In 2005, 2 students claimed to have found a large tooth embedded in the body of a deer on the loch shore. The boys would publish their findings, setting up a website, but expert analysis soon revealed that the tooth was actually an antler from a mootjock. The tooth was a publicity stunt to promote a horror novel by Stephen Alton called The Loch. And while these examples are from hoaxes that were eventually found out, there are likely many more that have been carried out successfully over the years that will never be revealed. It should also be noted that the 2 most iconic sets of images of the alleged Loch Ness Monster, that being the surgeon's photograph and the gargoyle and flipper photographs, both have some credible evidence to suggest that they were hoaxed, as described earlier. So what is the Loch Ness Monster really? According to Ronald Benz, a former member of the Loch Ness Phenomena Investigation Bureau, there is probably no single explanation for the monster. Benz wrote 2 skeptical books, the 1983 Loch Ness Mystery Solved and his 2017 The Loch Ness Mystery Reloaded. In these, he contends that an aspect of human psychology is the ability of the eye to see what it wants and expects to see, with him stating that sightings of the creature may be categorized as misidentifications of known animals, misidentifications of inanimate objects or effects on the loch, reinterpretations of Scottish folklore, hoaxes, and exotic species of large animals typically not found in the loch. A reviewer wrote that Benz had evolved into the author of the definitive skeptical book on the subject of the Loch Ness Monster. Benz himself does not call the sightings of the monster a hoax, but a myth in the true sense of the term, and states that the Loch Ness Monster is a sociological phenomenon and likely not a true flesh and blood creature, a belief held by most of the scientific community to this day, with scholars stating the legend of the Loch Ness Monster and of so many other mythical Highland creatures stems from the human imagination and inspiration provided by a mysterious landscape, with the conditions of this landscape being created before humans were ever present in the area. The glacial cycles and rising land forming a steep cold freshwater lake that centuries later may have inspired the idea that an enormous animal may have been trapped within it. The only observers of the loch were those living in its direct vicinity, from the early hunter-gatherers to the nobility of the Urquhart Castle and tradesmen of Inverness. The isolation of the Highlands keeping sightings of the monster to a minimum until the 20th century, when the myth exploded into worldwide fascination. But whether or not the Loch Ness Monster is a real flesh and blood creature does not diminish its importance to the Highland region and the country of Scotland as a whole. And since the 1930s sightings, the Loch Ness Monster has also made huge impacts on modern culture, making appearances in fiction literature since at least January 1934 in the short story The Monster of the Loch by William J. Mankin, and in film since at least May 1934 in the film The Secret of the Loch. 2 genres where it has featured prominently are children's programming and crypto fiction. Some examples of the former being the 1977 novel The Mysterious Tadpole by Stephen Kellogg, where a child takes care of a creature that keeps growing larger, and the 1992 novel Nessie the Mannerless Monster by Ted Hughes, where the monster goes to London. And in 2004, there is Scooby-Doo and the Loch Ness Monster, where the monster is ultimately depicted as a gentle giant, in the 2007 novel Luck of the Loch Ness Monster, Tale of the Picky Eater, by Alice Waverley Flatterly, where the monster grows large by being inadvertently fed by a child discarding food into the loch. In the 2007 film The Water Horse, Legend of the Deep, directed by Jay Russell, which features a young boy raising a young Loch Ness Monster to maturity, while trying to hide this fact from his family. The latter genre includes works such as the 1982 novel Monster, A Tale of Loch Ness by Jeffrey Konowitz, and the 2005 novel The Loch by Stephen Alton, which was promoted by a hoax that was mentioned earlier. The Loch Ness Monster has also made appearances in many other genres. such as the science fiction and horror genre, with the 1960 short story The Loch Ness Terror by Lionel Fanthorpe. Comedy, such as the 1961 film What a Whopper. Fantasy, such as the 1986 novel The Serpent Mage by Greg Bear. Time travel stories, such as the 1997 Quantum Leap novel Loch Ness Leap by Sandy Schofield, and horror, such as the 2001 film Beneath Loch Ness. It must also be mentioned how the Loch Ness Monster has become a great boon to the local tourism industry surrounding the loch since the sightings began to become world famous in the 1930s. A wide variety of visitors have come to the loch for decades now, hoping to capture a glimpse of the creature, with many entrepreneurs capitalizing on this increased interest in the loch and offering guided boat tours on the loch, with the main selling point being the faint possibility to encounter the alleged creature. By 2019, tourism surrounding the Loch Ness Monster was estimated to be a $50 million industry in Scotland. With the first 8 months of 2022, 150,000 visitors apparently took lake tours with Loch Ness by Jacobite, according to Freda Newton, the company's managing director. Everyone wants to believe in the creature. We see it every day on the faces of visitors, she says. There is palpable excitement when people board our boats that maybe, just maybe, they'll glimpse our most elusive friend. Gordon Menzies, who runs Castle Cruises Loch Ness, estimates that more than 70% of his customers visit because of the monster. He has spent a lifetime pondering this legend and says, "I think it is highly unlikely that a prehistoric creature still exists here. But given the dark, peaty waters of the loch, I see no reason to consider it impossible for something which we have not identified yet to exist here." In summation, the Loch Ness Monster has become a world-famous cultural icon and a permanent part of Scotland's and humanity's mythical history, with it still being found in all kinds of media to this very day. And despite the lack of hard evidence for the creature's existence, that will probably not mean the end of the search for the monster. For as long as Loch Ness and its dark depths are present, and there is still someone who is skeptical and willing to search, and as long as we humans enjoy hearing legends, there is little doubt we will forget the Loch Ness Monster, and the search will continue.